This meeting is being recorded.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here for today's session around building strong legal foundations. You're going to hear from two really great speakers, Angela and Erin. But before we get to that, I want to share a little bit about Black Empowerment Works. So Black Empowerment Works, and this session is a part of the Black Empowerment Works program. What we're aiming to do through this program is to promote Black self-determination, social mobility, and economic prosperity by resourcing and funding community-based Black-led work. So essentially, it's an equity-focused grant program that's aiming to invest in work at a grassroots level, work that's traditionally left out of funding processes or goes underfunded. This is our third year of operating the program, and to date, we've been able to invest $1.6 million into 58 Black-led bodies of work. Here's some important dates about the Black Empowerment Works program generally. So the application opened on May 2nd for both the grant and reviewer processes as community members make the investment decisions. That reviewer application is going to close on June 8th, and then July 1st is the deadline for the grant application. So be sure if you are submitting for a grant that you submit that application through our online system by July 1st at 5 p.m. Then we'll go through the process of reading applications, setting up reviewer grant applicant conversations to talk more about your work, and we'll be communicating those final decisions individually on August 29th, and then individually on August 24th, and publicly on August 29th. So the process happens pretty quickly. Beyond applying for the grant, we have other resources available to you to help you through that journey. If you visit our website, uwgc.org/BEW apply, you will find the information packet, which gives all of the details from the questions to how to navigate the online system and the elements of a strong application. You'll also find links for upcoming events. We have an information session on the Black Empowerment Works grant on the 31st, and we also have other community resource sessions coming up. Perhaps two of the most exciting resources that we provide to applicants along their journey is one, the ability to schedule a 30-minute question session or an unlimited number of those. So if you need support in filling out your application or you have questions, we're there to support you through that journey. And the second, which is new this year, is the ability to have a pre-submission review. So if you complete your application at least a week before the deadline, you can request us to review it on your behalf to look for some general outages. We are also available by phone, 513-762-7233, and by email at black-led@uwgc.org. But what you came to hear about today is this topic around building strong legal foundations. As mentioned, we have Angela White of the Black Lawyers Association of Cincinnati and Erin Childs of Pro Bono Partnership of Ohio to discuss the ways that their organizations can be helpful to you, but also to go beyond that, to discuss the legal considerations of grant stewardship, as well as alternatives to starting a nonprofit to secure grants. So for those who are already a nonprofit or are considering becoming a nonprofit, you'll also hear about common legal pitfalls and how you can avoid them. So that is enough of me talking. I am going to turn it over to our two lovely presenters. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you so much, Janae. I think I'm going to start off first, but Erin is joining me as well, and we are collaborating together in this presentation for you all that I hope you find helpful. I'm going to lead off with my slides, and because I won't be able to see you as I'm speaking, I'm going to turn my camera off, and if there's any questions, please call them out to me because I won't be able to see any hand raising in the screen. So give me 1 second and I will share my slides with you. Are you all able to see my full screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Awesome. Okay, so yes, we're talking about building strong legal foundations. And as Janae mentioned, my name is Angela White. I'm an attorney at Cincinnati Children's, but I'm also the Community Action Chair for the Black Lawyers Association of Cincinnati, and that's how I'm presenting to myself today with this group. About BLAC, we are a nonprofit bar association consisting of member attorneys, law students, legal professionals, and corporate partners. Our mission is twofold: not only to make the legal community more equitable for minority attorneys seeking to practice in the profession, but also to make the legal community in which we serve more equitable to the people in the community itself. So this collaboration with Black Empowerment Works specifically is aligned with our missions to make Greater Cincinnati a more inclusive place for minority-led ideas and minority-led spaces and opportunities. Again, about myself, I'm a member attorney with BLAC, and in my capacity, not only am I the Community Action Chair, but I'm volunteering my time today to talk to you all about grant stewardship, legal considerations as you walk yourselves through this grant application process. I've been an attorney here at Children's for 6 years, and my practice focus is in the research foundation. So I'm dealing a lot with grants, the grant award itself, moving through the contract of the grant deliverables, and also contract disputes related to grants. So I think I have a little bit of knowledge about grant stewardship and maybe the ability to answer some questions, but I think Erin, through her organization, probably will get more into the meat and substantive context of things that more may be applicable to you, but able to answer questions. Before I go any further, I'm going to stop sharing and flip it over to Erin so she can do an introduction. Then I'll flip it back to myself to go over just a high-level overview of the grant cycle. And then from there, back to Erin to get into some of the details throughout the different phases that I'm going to mention. And I think we'll take questions at the end. And since I can't see you all, it may be best for me to hold off on accepting questions until after or during once we get to Erin's presentation, if that makes sense. So
that's fair. Thanks, Angela. I am gonna
welcome.
Share my screen here and let me know if there are any issues, please. I know it was showing up small, so I apologize for that in advance. Are we good to go?
We are.
Great, good. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. This is exactly the type of audience that I love to be in front of, because if you haven't heard of Pro Bono Partnership of Ohio, we are here to help make sure all of you are building strong foundations for your organizations. To tell you a little bit about Pro Bono Partnership, if you haven't already heard of us, is we have attorney volunteers who provide free business legal services to nonprofit organizations. So if you qualify for our services, we have over 800 subject matter experts in all areas of business law and nonprofit law that we would be happy to share their expertise with you. So these are our corporate supporters. We're the third pro bono partnership nationally, and I show this slide to you because this is where our volunteers come from. They come from the biggest companies and law firms here in Cincinnati and in Dayton. And we, of course, are very grateful for their support to enable us to provide free business legal services. So in our first 6.5 years here in Southwest Ohio, we've had over 800 attorneys. We've provided direct free business legal services to over 280 nonprofit organizations on 2,000 different legal matters. That's $6.1 million worth of free legal services that is now poured back in the community. So the nonprofits and the leaders that work for these organizations are able to carry on their missions without having to worry about paying for legal services. And we also do a lot of educational outreach for nonprofits. To qualify to become a client of ours, we have just a few qualifiers. You have to be an established nonprofit. For those of you that are dialing in today who are not yet a nonprofit, if you're looking for resources, please reach out to us. We're happy to send you in the right direction. We primarily work with people-focused organizations. The nonprofits that we think we provide the most value to are those that are the ones on the ground doing the work, who are coming from the communities that they're trying to serve or who have experienced the challenges that they're trying to help others overcome. They have to be located in Cincinnati and Dayton and demonstrate that you're unable to pay for legal services. So if you hop over to our website, which is pbpohio.org, and it's on my first slide and on my last slide, you can sign up for either our newsletters or apply to be a client. I've been told that if you're reasonably organized, the application will take about 15 minutes. If you have to dig for some paperwork, it may take a few minutes longer than that, but we try to make it as easy as possible. So we have an online request for legal of assistance. We have a program coordinator who will work with you if you have any questions or concerns, or you're not sure what something is in the application process. And once you're accepted as a client, unless you suddenly are so well funded by United Way or other funders, which we always hope is the case, you're with us for as long as your organization is operating. There's no limit to the number of projects we can handle. We really want to be able to work with you and walk alongside with you as you grow and face the many challenges that nonprofits face. So the types of projects we handle, as you can see, these are all things that would strengthen your foundation and ensure that when issues do arise, you're in the best position to make sure that you are not waylaid from your mission and that you can keep on focusing on what you're doing. So we do lots of board work, contracts, governance, employment. If you have employees, you definitely need legal assistance with HR issues, lots of fundraising questions, trademarks, handbooks, real estate. These are all things that we have subject matter experts either on staff or that volunteer with us. So if you're a client of ours and if you're a nonprofit and you think you qualify for our service, this is what you get when you apply. Quality legal services from experienced company and law firm attorneys, where, Angela is a great contracts attorney and I'm going to get her to be a volunteer of ours, hopefully sooner rather than later. But we wouldn't ask her to trademark your logo. We get attorneys to jump in and do what they do every single day for their paying clients. We have 4 attorneys on staff, including myself, and you would be assigned to a pro bono partnership attorney who would kind of serve almost as your general counsel. They'd be the person that you would call and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. Is this a legal question? Or, this is something we're doing down the road. And we can really say like, great, when you get to this point, this is where we could jump in and help you. And when you get to this point, this is where we can jump in and help you. So we oversee all matters. And we also have an employment helpline. I know when I started as a nonprofit executive director, I did not have HR experience. And I wish I had someone that I could call to say, what do I need to do about this? Or I know there's questions I'm not supposed to ask, or what do I put in an employee's file, things like that. So we offer that to all of our clients as well. I also am continually reminded that there is a lot that I don't know on a daily basis. What Pro Bono Partnership does know is nonprofit law and how we can work to keep your foundations really strong. So even if you don't qualify for our services, or if you don't have a nonprofit, or you're not sure you want to form a nonprofit, or if you're on a board, I encourage you to register on our website to sign up for our educational outreach. We have either free or low cost in-person seminars and webinars. We partner a lot with organizations here and in Dayton. And we also put out some legal publications, if we're dealing with all the fires that are on our desk and you hear something in the news, or, these are things and you're like, well, it doesn't apply to me. I'm a small nonprofit, or we're all volunteers. We send out kind of these 1 to 2 page legal alerts that say, yes, this is applicable to nonprofits, and here's what happens if you don't do it. So we try to make it really easy for you to stay on top of these important things. Here are a couple of our upcoming programs. We actually have one running right now on independent contractors. Thompson Hine is partnering with us on that, but we do a lot. Last week in Dayton, we did a Nonprofit 101, which is an expanded version of what I'm going to talk about in 15 minutes later on to give you a quick overview. But as nonprofit leaders, this is not the reason why any of you went into this work. We know that. We appreciate it. So we want to make it as easy as possible for you to, we always say this is where the Better Business Bureau gold standard is, and this is the law. We want to make sure all of our nonprofits are above the law and heading in that direction, but how that looks is different for each organization. So we want to work with you to make sure that you're getting what you need and you're getting not too much, but just the right amount. So again, here is our information. And in a few minutes, I look forward to talking with you about some of the pitfalls we see and just some really general basic information that I think would be good for you all to have in the back of your head based on what we've seen with our organizations. So Angela, I'm going to stop sharing and send it over to you.
Thank you so much, Erin, for the introduction. That was awesome. As Erin mentioned, she's going to get into some of the meat of the pitfalls she sees in the nonprofit space. For the next probably 10, 15 minutes, I'm going to just talk about high level, the grant cycle, that the terminology that we use when we're talking about grant applications and grant processes, hitting on some key points in each part of that grant phase. And this may be all very basic things that you already know, but I think it's a good just foundation to understand like where you are when you are applying for a grant if you haven't done that before, and just to get you familiar with some of the terms that you may see as you're going out and looking for grants or as you are applying for the current grant, as well as some little iterations of things to be thoughtful of that I think Erin may go through in more detail, if not all of them, some of them, because she has a very thorough presentation after this. So again, I will share my slides or share my screen. 1 second. Okay, and because, yeah, all right. Everyone can see my slide or my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so the phases of a grant cycle are broken down into 3 phases: the pre-award cycle, the award cycle, and then the post-award cycle. And that's just generally, I think, anywhere you go when you're applying for grants, you either are in one phase or in multiple phases of these buckets, depending on how many grants you are managing at a time. So at any time, you can be in the pre-award cycle, which is where you are now with the current Black Empowerment Works grant. But if you all are seasoned and you have multiple grants that you're managing right now, you could be in the award or post-award phase with your other grants as you're in the pre-award phase. Each phase has unique aspects about it. In the pre-award phase, you're understanding your mission, you're establishing your business model, you're applying for the grants. In the award phase, obviously, you have been awarded the grant. So you're focused on executing whatever the deliverables and the scope of work that you said that you would be doing, fulfilling the requirements of that grant. And then post-award phase is just winding down and fulfilling any reporting requirements to close out that particular grant. So each bucket, again, has its own unique aspects about it. And I'm just gonna go over each one very high level. And then again, I think Erin will probably fill in some gaps and questions you may have. So in the pre-award phase, you're establishing your organizational mission. And I think in one of the slides Erin presented, she had board responsibilities, bylaws. That is, if you are not currently a 501(c) and you're seeking to be one, that is where you are essentially fulfilling that function and establishing yourself so that you can be eligible for a grant. Black Empowerment Works is unique in that you don't have to be a not-for-profit to receive a grant. Typically in the space that I'm in, grants are reserved for not-for-profits, but that's not, as you can see, always the case. But if you are not yet a not-for-profit, I know Black Empowerment Works is also unique in that you can be an individual seeking to receive a grant. I believe that was how it was last year. I don't think it has changed.
It has not.
But if that's the purpose, and if that's the case, then you are receiving grant funds under your Social Security number if you are not an established 501(c)(3) or you're not a for-profit business. That means something. So in this pre-award phase, while you have time, I believe that Janae shared that the application process closes July 1st. So, you know, we have plenty of times and you're being proactive by being in this conversation. If you're thinking about setting up that 501(c) and you're thinking about having that before you are in the process of applying for a grant, you want to make sure that you have all the filings up to date, or you have all the paperwork that you need. And you think about the fiduciary duties that come along with establishing a 501(c). It's not just you establish it and you're done. There are the bylaws that Erin mentioned or in her presentation show that you have to create. There are certain board members that you have to have in order for it to be an established 501(c)(3), such as your secretary, president, or not president, secretary, and other things of that nature. And those are considerations that you want to have as you think about applying for our grant while you're in what we call this pre-award phase. And then therefore, and I think I've mentioned it, but applying for grants, specifically for the Black Empowerment Works grants, there are certain eligibility requirements, and that they're listed on the website. Because of the, I don't want to go out of it and into it, but I think that if you all are here, you have made yourself familiar with what those requirements are to even be eligible to receive that grant. If you haven't, I would familiarize yourself with those before applying, and then making sure that you are in compliance with those as you apply for not just this grant, but other grants in the future. I think Black Empowerment Works really has raised the bar in inclusivity and allowing for really anyone seeking to do great work in the community with Black-led thoughts to do that. A lot of grants are not as inclusive with the way they allow individuals to use money or even be eligible to apply for, have access to grants. So the eligibility requirements are not as stringent as others I have seen in this space, which is awesome, but they still exist. So before you move forward in this pre-award phase that you're currently in, you want to familiarize yourselves with those and work towards compliance. So that's the pre-award phase and things to consider. After pre-award, we go to the award. So congratulations. Hopefully it will be this particular grant with Black Empowerment Works. You receive the grant. So what do you do next? Depending on the nature of your business, if you are an individual taking funding as an individual under your social security number, then maybe you want to consider what that means for you tax-wise. That would be considered income, and what that means if that is considered income for tax purposes, to see whether or not it makes more sense to establish a 501(c)(3), and maybe it makes more sense to maybe figure out if there could be a fiscal sponsor. And if those words don't make sense now, then I think Erin may go into more detail about them later, and if not, I can answer questions at the end. But figuring out the business model that works best for you, and also being mindful of the deliverables that you said that you were going to provide as a recipient of the grant. Again, I think this Black Empowerment Works grant is amazing because unlike other grants that I've seen, where not only are they seeking for you to provide the deliverables, but they want ownership in those deliverables in a certain way. Nothing that I've seen from Black Empowerment Works suggests that the work that you create under it belongs to United Way. But be mindful of other grants that sometimes, because they're giving you money, there are more strings attached. And one of the most common strings attached is that intellectual property that's coming out of and being developed from the grant. And as Erin mentioned in one of her bullet points, I am not an IP attorney. Here at Children's, we have an entire IP department because we have so much development that happens under our research, under our grants. If there is something that you think needs to be protected in your work, not in this particular grant, but maybe also in this particular grant, it may be mindful now to think about how you go about seeking that protection from a legal intellectual property perspective, and getting some legal protections around whatever you're considering to move forward under the grant in the future with other grants. So that's all the thoughts I have on the award phase. Essentially in this part, you're doing the work, you're doing what you said you're going to be doing, and also just being mindful of the tax implications of receiving the money, as well as the contractual obligations of what you have agreed to in regards to sharing and having ownership of that deliverables that you are doing underneath those funds. So then from there, we go over to the post-award phase. In this phase, essentially, the work is done, and maybe you have reporting requirements. I'm not familiar with what Black Empowerment Works requires, but a lot of grants do require that, 60 days after or 90 days after the final award period, you're going to produce a final report as well as, receipts documenting your final expenditures. That's a common thing that I see in the contracts of grants. And I don't know if it's in Black Empowerment Works, but maybe some iteration of that will be in their grant requirements. So just knowing that you're required to be in compliance with that as well. So you don't just receive the money, do the work, and then once it's over, it's over. There could be some, 90-day requirements for shoring up final reporting, final accounting, things of that nature in this part of the grant phase. And then of course, in this phase, you're looking to see whether or not you're going to get funding for year 2, or if you're going to get funding for, or extending that current funding. If you didn't use all those funds, asking for an extension to complete the work, all kind of happens between the award and post-award phase. So this is the broad overview of the life of a grant, the grant cycle. And then I think that I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Erin, who will give you more details about some of the nuances in each phase of that cycle.
Thanks, Angela. You're over promising my ability here. No, I'm gonna talk really fast about all of this. Let's see. Are you seeing my screen? Let me put it in full screen mode here. All good?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so building strong legal foundations. First, because I'm a lawyer, I have to give you just a quick disclaimer that this is not legal advice. I'm giving you general information on best practices. I hope you all will consider applying to become clients, so that way we can give you legal advice. So in 20 minutes, I'm going to talk generally about the difference between being in a nonprofit versus being a tax exempt organization, a little bit about the importance of corporate governance and some things for you to look at, employment law. I know a lot of organizations start off as all volunteers, but as you grow and hopefully can hire and pay for staff, just some really general considerations. And then really quickly, I'll go over intellectual property and the fact that we have it, we all have it, and our organizations have it, and what you need to protect. So without further ado, nonprofit versus tax exempt status. This is something that a lot of people who are new to the area of nonprofits get confused. There is a difference between a nonprofit and a tax exempt organization. A nonprofit is a function of state law. Those of us that are on this webinar today, we can start a nonprofit in about 15 minutes. We'd go to the Ohio Secretary of State, would draft articles of incorporation, would appoint a statutory agent. I would appoint Angela. She seems very organized, would come up with a name, and then we could be an Ohio nonprofit. And if we stop right there, that's enough for you to open a bank account under the nonprofit's name, to have board members. By law, you'd have to have 3 board members. You could enter into contracts on behalf of the nonprofit. And so some individuals and organizations stop right there. The next step is to become a tax exempt organization. And to do that, you have to apply to the IRS. So you'd have to do that first step of applying to Ohio to become an Ohio nonprofit. And then you'd have to apply to the IRS for tax exempt status. You'd be a public charity, most likely. There's, 27, 28 different types of 501c organizations. Almost all of the ones we deal with, and the ones that you think about when you think about a typical nonprofit, is probably a 501c3 charitable organization. So why would you stop? Why would you go on and apply to the IRS and not just stop with the state nonprofit? There's a lot of advantages to applying to the IRS for tax exempt status. There's no federal income tax on your related business income and donations. The one that is huge is donors can deduct their charitable contributions. You can receive grant funding and support from private foundations. This Black Empowerment Works grant is very unique in that the United Way is giving grants to individuals, to for-profit businesses and nonprofits, but the majority of private foundations and private family foundations, a lot of where we all get our funding in the nonprofit world, the first step is to be a 501c3 tax exempt organization where you have to apply to the IRS. And if you're not that, then they cannot fund you. You can also be exempt from certain state taxes, and you've got a good, it helps when you're a nonprofit. You have increased goodwill and credibility in the community. I'm not just Erin Childs with a good idea, but I am a nonprofit. I have a board. I've committed that I don't own this organization. The organization is run by the board. If this organization were to fold, I wouldn't personally benefit from what's left over. Those are all things that we tell the IRS when they grant tax exempt status. So there are many disadvantages that come with becoming a tax exempt organization. And I'm happy to have that conversation with any of you. I spend a lot of time talking to individuals who have a great program or an idea, and they think they want to start a nonprofit, to really think about what you're jumping into and whether you need to add all these layers of complication to the good work that you're trying to do in our community. So as a nonprofit, we have a lot of operational limitations. We can only do what we told the IRS we were going to do in our application for tax exempt status. No annulment, meaning insiders, people who are closely related to the organization, whether it be founders or their family members, board members or their family members, or other key employees, we can't personally benefit by virtue of our relationship to the nonprofit organization. We can get paid. I am a paid executive director. I have 3 children who all need braces, and hopefully someday will go on to college, but I can't get paid more than is reasonable for an executive director in my position. And there's all sorts of rules that come with that, and we're happy to advise you on that at any point. No political activities. So nonprofits cannot take any position on any elected official, period, whether it's someone running for school board, president of the local PTO, up to president of the United States. As a nonprofit, we can take no position at all. And that is one way that organizations lose their tax exempt status. And limited lobbying. That doesn't mean no lobbying, but limited lobbying. And we always encourage our clients to lobby. I mean, who better than the people who are experiencing the impact of potential legislation or current legislation than to lobby to change it or make it better or keep it, but it does have to be limited. So if you are a nonprofit that does lobbying, hopefully you have legal counsel, or if not, call us to talk with you about how to do that and make sure you stay within the law in terms of how much lobbying you're doing. And there's also a lot of increased scrutiny on nonprofits. So we all have to file our annual tax return. It's called a 990. There's different forms depending on whether you make less than $5,000, in income, or above $50,000. But everybody has to fill out some form of the 990. And if you have to fill out the whole form, it asks a lot of information, and it's available to the public. So you can get on, Charity Navigator or GuideStar and look up Pro Bono Partnership of Ohio or any other public charity, and you can see who their board members are. You can see who their key employees are, how much they're paid every year in terms of salary plus benefits plus anything else. You can see where exactly all the funds are that came in, how much they spent on each program. I mean, no business has to do that at all. I mean, can you imagine a list of what everyone makes at P&G or GE or any of the big companies in town? They don't have to do that because they're not a nonprofit. But as a nonprofit, because we are granted this tax exempt status, the whole community can kind of act as a watchdog to make sure that we're not only operating within the law, but that we are making good use of the public's funds. So in order to become a tax exempt organization, that's the next step up from being just an Ohio nonprofit, you fill out a form 1023 with the IRS. And so we always, when someone applies to be a client, we look and say, what did you tell the IRS you're doing versus what you're doing now? And if a lawyer drafts your 1023 application for tax exemption, and it's a lawyer who's familiar with nonprofit law, which we would encourage, they'll say something really broad. For us, it's to strengthen our community by engaging attorney volunteers to provide free business, legal services, and education to nonprofits, and any other reason, under the law. We kind of make it general, but a lot of organizations we see, especially from enterprising individuals who maybe aren't familiar with this type of work, are very specific. And so we want to make sure that it's broad enough and that you're still doing what you told the IRS that you said you were going to do. And if not, we can help you fix it, make it more broad, but you always want to look and make sure that they're consistent. So if you file a 1023 and the IRS grants your application, they'll give you a determination letter that says, you're a 501c3 public charity as of this date. And we at Pro Bono Partnership, we call it your golden ticket, because you need that piece of paper when you apply for grants. It's usually Exhibit A. When you apply for sales tax exemption, that's something that you'll always need to have, and it'll state whether you're a public charity versus a private foundation. And so, in most cases, you'd want to be a public charity. And then the IRS Form 990 is what we talked about earlier. That's the annual information tax return. And you have to file that every single year. And one thing to note is that all three of these things, they're open to the public. So if you are a nonprofit organization, any member of the public can ask you for these things at any point, and you have to give it to them within a reasonable amount of time. And that just kind of goes back into that transparency that's built into it. So the 990 is so not fun and not glamorous. We just filed ours a few weeks ago. It's, 30 pages of a lot of information, but it's the way that the IRS, number one, and also the general public and funders can evaluate the work that we're doing. You can see there's all sorts of information on there, and funders are much more sophisticated than they've ever been. United Way, they have professional staff that go through all of these things, and they are well versed in how to do it. But we're also seeing that a lot of family foundations and other smaller foundations and company foundations are really digging into these things more, which, is good or bad depending on how you look at it. But we just want to make sure that everyone takes these filings seriously and that they do them on time. So board governance basics. The reason why I put this in here is because if you are a newer organization or are considering forming an organization, it's important that the people that you bring into your organization understand their role and that you understand their role. So as I said earlier, no one person owns a nonprofit. The founder certainly feels the most vested in a nonprofit organization, but if you make the choice to become a nonprofit versus a for-profit for a lot of the benefits I talked about earlier, no one person owns it. And the fiduciary responsibilities fall to those board members. So in Ohio, if you become an Ohio nonprofit, which was that first step we talked about earlier, by law, you have to have 3 directors. Anything after that is great, but you always have to have 3 directors. And all 3 of those directors have all of these fiduciary responsibilities on here: the duty of care, the duty of loyalty, to manage accounts, and compliance. And there's a great guide that I've linked there that we recommend that all board members read and that they read annually. I include that link when we have our, seasonal allergies, when we have our annual board meeting, because it's a great reminder of what the role of a board member is. And as all of these things state here, a lot of it is common sense. Board members have to act in the best interest of the organization, period. It doesn't matter whether they have a business that may profit from it, whether they personally profit from it. Every decision they make for the organization has to be in the best interest of the organization. Things get messy, a little sticky when there's conflicts of interest. If you want to hire somebody that's a board member to do work, you can't just do it. There's certain steps the IRS wants you to take. That doesn't mean you can't do it. A lot of these conflicts of interest are easily overcome, but there's certain steps that you need to take. And what we've seen with, our almost 300 clients is those that bring people on board who understand their fiduciary responsibilities and understand that they're there to benefit the organization and the organization only, have a much easier time going forward. We're seeing a lot of headbutting on boards right now, more so than ever before. I think, COVID and the pandemic and everything that is resulting from that, funding has completely dried up for some organizations to the point where they're talking about dissolving or merging or getting rid of some of, the favorite projects that just aren't bringing in the funding. And 99% of people who join boards do so because they care about the missions, and that 1% of individuals that don't really can not only be a big headache for your organization, but we've seen it get so bad that organizations have really almost stopped operating so they can deal with this board member. So, board governance is important. It's not fun. It's not exciting to think about, but it's not hard. It's not hard to do and to make these things happen. So we would love the opportunity to walk you through any of this. And these fiduciary responsibilities, they're not just the right thing to do, they're the law. And trustees can be held individually responsible if they breach their fiduciary duties. I gave some examples here, but they can be on the hook to have to pay things, pay fines, pay payroll taxes. The IRS can come after board members individually. And if they're doing all the things, if they're upholding all those fiduciary duties, and that guide that I linked to gives very specific ways that you can fulfill your duties as a board member, you won't be held individually responsible, even if you make a really bad decision. A bad decision with good intent and research does not usually equal being held individually responsible. But you're not just on the board making decisions and doing whatever with no real responsibilities. They are real. And if more board members understood this from the beginning, it'd be a lot easier. Your bylaws, your code of regulations. So when you apply for tax exempt status from the IRS, you say that you have them. I would say that at least 25% of the organizations who apply for our services that have their tax exempt status don't have them. So we are happy to help you draft them. Your bylaws, they're called your code of regulations. They're an internal document. That's how the board operates. We suggest you keep them as simple and as streamlined and as flexible as possible. And they are really important. So if you do have bylaws, we recommend that you look at them and make sure you're doing what they say. And if they don't, then you should amend them and adopt them properly under the terms of the bylaws. This is, in case you are really getting into it, these are some recommended bylaw positions or provisions that we encourage you to have. I won't go through all of them, but if you look at them, you'll see these are all dealing with how the board functions. There's nothing in there about, and these are our 3 programs, and here's who runs what program. You don't have to amend your bylaws every time you shift. This is how the board operates. So the IRS, we keep talking about the IRS and the 990, they revised it in 2008, and they ask a lot of questions about corporate governance. So it's not just me, a lawyer, who sees how these things go sideways on a regular basis, encouraging you to do this. The IRS thinks it's really important. The 990 asks questions about executive compensation. How did my board come to decide on my pay? How are board minutes documented and maintained? Do you have a conflict of interest policy? Do you have whistleblower and document destruction policies? Those 2 with the little asterisks next to them, they're not required by the IRS, but they really want you to have them. If you're filling out your Form 1023 and they say, do you have a conflict of interest policy? And you click no, a pop-up box will come up, at least it used to, and it'll say, why not? Here's why we think it's important. Here's a link to a sample one. The government really is saying like a conflict of interest policy is needed in your organization. So as I said earlier, what is good governance differs based on the organizations, not only what you're doing, but who's on your board, how your board is operating, whether you have employees, whether you're an all volunteer board. So there is no one size fits all. And that's why it's important to understand what has to be done. So you can do at the very least the bare minimum required by law, and then hopefully be heading towards that better business standard. But if you go through the work of forming a nonprofit organization, we want to make sure that the reason why you close your doors isn't because of something simple like this that can be overcome. We also recommend that you adopt those 3 policies that I mentioned that the IRS asks about in your 990. These are things we draft for our clients on a regular basis, and not just draft them, but explain what they are and how to implement them. The last thing I'll say about corporate governance is that directors and officers insurance, sometimes called D&O insurance, is something that all of you should have. I would never join a board that didn't have directors and officers insurance. And I know it can be pricey based on small budgets. Ours, I think, is a couple $100s a year, but that indemnifies every single trustee, director on my board for the decisions they make. So if something were to go south and they were to get sued, that we would indemnify them for that. So just add to your to-do list, look up directors and officers insurance. And while we don't recommend insurers, there's other great umbrella organizations in Cincinnati that could perhaps point you in the right direction. I'm not sure if United Way does, but Leadership Council for Nonprofits, One Source Center for nonprofits also have a lot of great resources for nonprofits. So employment issues, these last few slides, I'm going to go through really fast because I don't know how many of you have employees, but I just want it to be, I always call it the spidey sense in the back of your head. Employment law for nonprofits is essentially the same as it is for for-profit corporations. And the two biggest issues we see are classifying employees. The first is whether someone's an independent contractor or an employee. Independent contractors are way simpler to navigate. You pay someone to do a job, you don't withhold payrolls, they're not eligible for benefits, you just give them a 1099 at the end of the year, versus an employee where you have to withhold all their taxes, they're eligible for whatever benefits you offer, et cetera, et cetera. The Department of Labor does not like independent contractors, and someone is not an independent contractor because you say they are. There are some really specific tests that the government has laid forth in terms of who can be an independent contractor. So, when a new client calls up and I ask them, how many employees do you have? And they're like, oh, we've got 4, but we're all independent contractors. The executive director, the director of operations, the program coordinator. I always say, I'm not an employment attorney, but this is a huge red flag. And the reason why these are so big for organizations, unlike that governance stuff, which really is just internal and how the board operates, people in the nonprofit world and the for-profit world are our biggest asset and also our greatest potential area of liability. Things go south when it's human beings interacting with human beings, and everything's good until it's not. And there are plenty of plaintiffs' law firms out there that would be happy to listen to your disgruntled former worker. And, they may go in saying they were discriminated against for one reason, and what the employment attorney, plaintiff's attorney will ask a lot of questions about are, what were your duties? How were you paid? Were you paid overtime? Things like that. So you've got your independent contractor versus an employee. And then once you've have someone who's actually an employee, the other big area I want you to think about is whether they're exempt versus non-exempt. If someone is non-exempt, they get paid overtime for every minute they work over 40 hours a week. They get time and a half by law versus an exempt employee. I'm an exempt employee. I can work 5 hours or I can work 100 hours a week. I get paid the same. Again, the Department of Labor does not like exempt employees. The idea is that everyone should be paid for every hour that they work. So in order for someone to be exempt, they also have to pass a lot of different tests that the Department of Labor has set forth. And again, your offer letter can say you're exempt. You can tell someone they're exempt. Your handbook can say they're exempt, but we don't get to decide. So if you haven't had an HR professional or an attorney review the status of your employees, that's usually the first thing we do to make sure that that's correct. So the few things you want to make sure for employees is that everyone's an employee at will, meaning they can leave at any time and you can fire them anytime. And you want to make sure that that is clear. Personnel policies, do you have them? And if you do, make sure they're followed. It's actually worse to have a book of policies that no one follows than it is to have no policies at all. So we're happy to work with you through any of those things. Kind of the same for hiring and evaluations and terminations. There's just a lot of things you need to think about. And again, most specifically in the areas of employment law where you're dealing with people and feelings, it's critical to have someone guide you through these steps. So intellectual property, do we have it? Yes, every single for-profit, nonprofit has intellectual property. So you want to make sure you're protecting it and also taking a step back to see if you are using others' intellectual property and what that looks like. So things that nonprofits typically can protect, their programs. You spend a lot of time putting together your programs, your materials, your logos. There's different ways you can protect those, whether it's copyright, trademarks, even your donor list. Those are considered a trade secret most of the time. So you want to make sure that those things are protected as much as possible. And in the nonprofit world, which is so awesome, is we'll work with organizations who are like, we don't need to copyright it. Like, we hope other people use it. Like, we've created all these great things. We want the impact to multiply throughout the community, and that's awesome. But what we encourage them to do is you stop for a second and say, yes, you own it and you want to be able to have other people use it, but you don't want another person to take what you've created and then them benefit from it, and make money off it. You're trying to, kind of free community, free share it. And it's not a bad thing to control how that is done. So just to at least mindfully make those decisions. And on the flip side of that, you want to make sure you're properly using other people's intellectual property. So whether you're using music that you find online at your community events, using pictures, you have to ask permission of attendees lots of times to use photos. And just because you can find it on a Google search doesn't mean you can use it. And our program coordinator, who was our second hire, she was listening to one of our educational seminars. We're in intellectual property. It was like 2 hours of IP and how to protect it. And she left there. She's like, oh my gosh, everything I put on social media, I've just found online. And I was like, oh, so don't do as we did 7 years ago, do as we do now, which is to make sure that we have it. And I know I just covered a lot of things in a short period of time. So I hope that you will get on our mailing list and reach out to us with any questions. I'll finish with when to call an attorney. Everything on here are things where you definitely want to stop and consult a professional to make sure that your organization is covered before entering into any major contracts, business transactions with the board or other disqualified persons. So just think about the board and their immediate relatives and anyone who's a key employee. Again, employment issues. When you hear from another agency or another attorney, those typically aren't good things. So we want to make sure that you all keep on keeping on doing your good work in the community. So I know we have a few minutes, and Angela and I covered a lot of information in a really quick period of time, but I'm sure she'll agree with me that we want to be continued resources for everyone here, and that we're grateful for your willingness to jump in the community. So I'll turn it over to Janae, or if there's any questions, just jump in.
I do have one question that I would love for you to answer. Can you say a little bit about like fiscal sponsorship and what you see as maybe some pros and cons of it?
Absolutely, yes. Fiscal sponsorship is a great thing. And if you called me and say, I want to start a nonprofit, that's the first thing I'm going to encourage you to look into. That's a way for you as an individual or as a not tax exempt organization to receive funders who require you to have a tax exempt status to get that funding. So what that is you would partner with an existing 501c3 tax exempt organization who would in a sense, allow you to use your tax exempt status to apply for grant funding. And there's a couple different types of fiscal sponsorship. And when they work really well, what it looks like is you apply for the grant, they give the grant to the tax exempt organization, and they give you the funding. In practicality, there's a lot of stopgap measures that are in there. The tax exempt organization has to have some oversight. They need to make sure that what you're using the funds for is in alignment with their mission and that you're using them appropriately. And some fiscal sponsors will charge a fee and they'll handle all the back office stuff. Others don't. There are several fiscal sponsors in our area. And I think, Janae, correct me if I'm wrong, there was one that is speaking. I think all they do is fiscal sponsorships, but it's a great way for you to run your program and do your work and not be bogged down by everything that Angela and I talked about in the past 45 minutes. And it won't preclude you from down the road pulling out from that fiscal sponsor and standing alone as your own organization, if that's how you grow. But that can be a great alternative to starting a nonprofit. Angela,
can I piggyback off of that? Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Just to say, especially for those who are in the pre-award phase of the grant cycle, you don't have your not-for-profit established just yet. In consideration of, yes, there may be a fee for a sponsorship, but think about the tax implications of taking something under your Social Security and balancing that, as well as just knowing, to Erin's point, that the fiscal sponsor there's things in between that they'll be looking at from a financial analyst perspective that maybe you don't have the experience to at this point yet to know or to do. So definitely, if you are in that space, that's something to consider as you work towards your grant application, not just this one, but ones in the future.
Any questions from folks attending before we close out? All right. Well, thank you all so much for attending today's session all about building strong legal foundations. In follow-up of this session, we'll send you the decks, as well as later we'll have a recording available. If you have any questions for our Black Empowerment Works team, feel free to reach out to us at 513-762-7233 or by emailing black-led@uwgc.org. Have a great rest of your afternoon, y'all.
Thank you.
Don't be overwhelmed, Geneva.